The gym floor was never supposed to be remembered. For decades, it did exactly what it was built to do: absorb noise, soften footsteps, carry the weight of generations without complaint. Sneakers squeaked across it. Folding chairs scraped against it during assemblies. Cheerleaders practiced routines beneath flickering fluorescent lights, while banners from forgotten championships hung above like relics of another era. It was polished, resurfaced, repainted, treated as an object, a surface, something that existed only to be walked on. And yet beneath it, something waited. The story does not begin in 1994. It begins much later, on a weekday morning when the school was mostly empty. Summer break had thinned the building of its usual life. No lockers slamming. No laughter echoing down the halls. Just the distant hum of ventilation and the rhythmic clatter of construction tools. The district had approved a long overdue renovation. Nothing dramatic, just repairs. New flooring, updated wiring. An attempt to modernize a building that had quietly aged into irrelevance. No one expected history to interrupt the schedule. When the first panel of the gym floor was lifted, it felt unremarkable. Old wood, dust, the smell of time sealed away. The kind of smell that belongs to basements and archives. Workers joked about how schools were built sturdier back then. Someone commented that they didn't make things like this anymore. It was all routine, all forgettable, until it wasn't. What stopped the work wasn't something overtly horrifying at first glance. There was no immediate shock, no cinematic moment of screaming or running. Instead, there was confusion, a pause, a silence that stretched just a few seconds longer than it should have. The kind of silence that forms when people realize they're looking at something that doesn't fit into any known category of normal. Beneath the gym floor was a structural modification that made no sense. It wasn't part of the original blueprints. It wasn't documented in any renovation records. It was deliberate, carefully executed, and clearly designed to conceal, not support, the space above it. The kind of alteration that required approval, planning, and intention. Someone had decided at some point that whatever lay beneath should not be seen. The workers stepped back. One of them wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly aware of how quiet the room felt. The gym, empty and cavernous, seemed to amplify the moment. The banners overhead didn't move. The basketball hoops hung motionless. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. Schools are places we associate with beginnings, first friendships, first heartbreaks, first realizations about the world and ourselves. They are meant to be temporary spaces, stepping stones toward adulthood. No one imagines them as places where things are hidden forever. And yet this one had been. News of the discovery did not spread immediately. At first, it stayed contained within the bureaucracy of procedure. Calls were made. Work was halted. Administrators arrived, wearing concern that felt rehearsed, incomplete. There was talk of safety inspections, of liability, of making sure protocols were followed. Language designed to smooth edges, to keep panic at bay. But unease was a way of leaking through even the most carefully chosen words. Someone remembered something, a half-thought, dismissed almost as soon as it formed. Someone else felt a strange sense of déjà vu, like standing in a room you've been in before only in dreams. The gym, suddenly, did not feel neutral anymore. It felt charged, as if the floor had been carrying more than weight all these years. The school itself had a reputation. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of place no one ever wrote about. It sat in a town that prided itself on being forgettable in the best way. Safe, stable, predictable. The kind of town people left, but rarely escaped. The kind where nothing bad ever really happened. At least, nothing that stayed spoken. As officials reviewed the anomaly beneath the floor, a pattern began to form. Not in facts yet, but in feeling. The sense that this was an accident. That this was a neglect or poor planning. This was something that had been done on purpose, and done carefully enough to survive 30 years of use without discovery. 30 years is a long time to keep a secret. It's long enough for students to become parents, for teachers to retire or die, for records to be archived, then digitized, then quietly lost. Long enough for memory to soften, distort, or vanish entirely. long enough for a town to forget the shape of its own past. But places don't forget the way people do. The gym had witnessed everything. Pep rallies filled with forced enthusiasm. Assemblies where names were called and futures were announced. Games where entire crowds moved as one organism, cheering, grieving, celebrating. The same floor had carried joy, disappointment, routine boredom. It had been the heart of the school, the one room everyone passed through eventually, and all the while, it had been standing on top of something unspeakable. As word began to circulate, carefully, quietly, older residents felt something stir that they couldn't quite identify. A discomfort they hadn't felt in decades. A question they thought they'd answered long ago, or maybe never asked out loud. Names hovered at the edge of thought, just out of reach. Faces from yearbooks. Empty spaces where people should have been. The official statement, when it finally came, was measured and vague. There had been an unexpected structural discovery. Further investigation was underway. There was no immediate danger to the public. Classes would resume as scheduled in the fall. But the damage was already done. Because once the idea took hold that something had been hidden beneath the gym floor, people began to look backward instead of forward, began to replay old memories with new suspicion, began to ask not what had been found, but what had been lost. This was not a story about a single moment of violence or sudden tragedy that shattered a community overnight. This was a story about accumulation, about small decisions made easier by silence, about the difference between not knowing and choosing not to know. The floor had done its job too well. For 30 years, it had covered footsteps that never returned. It had echoed with cheers loud enough to drown out unanswered questions. It had been polished until it shone, reflecting a version of the town that felt safe enough to believe in. Now, with part of it torn away, that reflection was gone. What remained was a hollow space where certainty used to be, and the unsettling realization that the truth had never been buried deep, only just out of sight, waiting for someone to finally look down. In 1994, the school still smelled new enough to believe in the future. The lockers were dented but functional, their paint chipped in places where generations of hands had slammed them shut in frustration or relief. Hallways buzzed with a low, constant noise of teenage life, arguments that mattered deeply in the moment, laughter that carried too far, the sharp ring of the bell slicing time into manageable pieces. It was a year that felt ordinary, which is often how the most important years begin. The 12 students were never introduced to one another as a group. They didn't sit together in the same classes or share a single identity that made them stand out. Some were athletes, others barely passed gym. A few were honor roll students, quiet and dependable. Others had reputations that followed them like shadows: trouble, attitude, distraction. What connected them wasn't who they were, but how easily they were overlooked. At the start of the school year, all 12 were present. Their names appeared on attendance sheets. Their faces were captured in the first round of yearbook photos, frozen in awkward smiles and expressions that hadn't yet learned how to hide discomfort. Teachers knew them well enough to mispronounce their names in the same familiar ways. Classmates recognized them without truly seeing them. Nothing about them suggested they would vanish. The first disappearance didn't feel like a disappearance at all. It happened quietly, between weeks, the way so many things do in high school. One student stopped showing up to homeroom. A guidance counselor mentioned a possible transfer. Someone said the family was moving. There was a shrug, a nod, and life continued. High school trained people to accept absence without ceremony. By the time the second student was gone, the pattern still wasn't obvious. Another explanation surfaced: disciplinary issues, alternative schooling, a vague reference to problems at home. The words were delivered with enough authority to discourage follow-up. Students are taught early that curiosity can be inappropriate, that some things are not their business. The third disappearance came with rumors instead of facts. A fight, a suspension that never ended. Whispers passed between lockers, changing shape as they moved. No one could point to a single moment where the student officially left, only the growing certainty that they were no longer there. Their locker was cleaned out over a weekend, their desk reassigned. Absence became normalized. Teachers adjusted attendance lists. Administrators updated files. The machinery of the school absorbed the loss the way it absorbed everything else, efficiently, impersonally. Each disappearance was processed as an individual event, sealed off from the others by paperwork and time. But among the students, something else was happening. There were moments, small, fleeting, when someone would notice a pattern and then immediately doubt themselves. 12 seemed like too many to be coincidence, but not enough to trigger alarm. After all, people left schools all the time. Lives changed. Families moved. Stories ended without conclusions. Yet there were details that didn't sit right. One student was known for perfect attendance, the kind of reliability teachers counted on. Another had talked openly about plans for graduation just days before they stopped showing up. A third had siblings still enrolled at the school, siblings who avoided questions with a kind of practiced tension that felt learned rather than natural. The gym became a quiet crossroads for many of these last sightings. After-school activities, mandatory assemblies, practices that ran late into the evening. It was the one place where everyone passed through eventually, regardless of social group or schedule. The gym was where the school became a single body, breathing together under harsh lights. Several of the missing students were last remembered there, not in dramatic moments, but in fragments. Sitting on the bleachers during a pep rally, waiting near the exit after practice, lingering longer than usual as the crowd thinned. Moments that didn't feel important until they were all that remained. By the time the sixth student was gone, unease had settled in. It wasn't loud or confrontational. It was a low hum of discomfort, an unspoken awareness that something was off. But unease without language tends to collapse inward. People question their own instincts before questioning authority. Administrators addressed concerns with calm efficiency. They reminded students and parents that every situation was different, that privacy laws limited what could be shared, that speculation helped no one. The tone was reassuring, and reassurance can be a powerful sedative. The town echoed that sentiment. Parents told their children to focus on their own lives. Neighbors dismissed the talk as teenage exaggeration. Local newspapers mentioned nothing beyond routine school news. Without external validation, fear struggled to take shape. The seventh and eighth disappearances blurred together in memory. Time moved faster as the year progressed. Midterms, holidays, snow days. The calendar filled itself, leaving little room to linger on who was missing. New student arrived. Substitute teachers miscounted heads and assumed it was their mistake. By spring, the faces of the absent students had already begun to fade at the edges. High school is ruthless that way. It demands constant attention, and anything that falls outside the immediate moment risks being erased. Still, there were those who noticed. A friend who kept a seat open in class longer than necessary. A teacher who hesitated before calling a name they knew would go unanswered. A coach who remembered a jersey number with no one left to wear it. These moments accumulated quietly, like dust in unused corners. The ninth disappearance came with a sense of finality that no one could explain. It wasn't louder or more public than the others, but landed differently, perhaps because the year was nearing its end, perhaps because denial had grown thin. People began to look at each other differently in the hallways, as if silently counting. The 10th, 11th, and 12th happened close enough together that they could no longer be dismissed as unrelated. But by then, the systems meant to respond had already adapted. The explanations were pre-written, the files prepared. The emotional groundwork for silence had been laid. There was no assembly, no announcement, no collective acknowledgement that 12 students who started the year together would not finish it. Instead, there was a gradual acceptance of absence as a fact of life. Graduation approached with its usual mix of anticipation and anxiety. Caps were ordered, programs printed, the list of names finalized, and in that list, the missing students simply weren't there. No asterisks, no footnotes, just empty spaces where names might have been, unnoticed unless you knew exactly what to look for. The class moved on, carrying with them a memory that never fully formed into a question. Years later, many would struggle to explain what happened. They would remember that something felt wrong, but not when it started. They would recall faces without being able to place them. They would wonder, fleetingly, if they had imagined the whole thing. That is how disappearances succeed, not through force, but through fragmentation. The 12 students did not vanish in a single night. They dissolved slowly, piece by piece, until their absence became less remarkable than their presence had ever been. And by the time anyone might have asked the right question, the moment to ask it had already passed. What remained was a class that graduated incomplete, and a mystery that had been hiding in plain sight from the very beginning. The town had a way of explaining things without ever really explaining them. It was the kind of place where people recognized each other's cars before they recognized each other's faces, where routines mattered more than questions. Mornings followed the same pattern. Coffee poured into the same mugs, the same radio stations murmur in the background, the same streets carrying people toward jobs they'd held for years. Stability was the town's greatest pride, and anything that threatened it was treated like a temporary disturbance rather than a problem to be solved. When students began disappearing from the school, the town didn't react with fear. It reacted with logic. Logic is comforting. Logic allows people to believe that every effect has a reasonable cause, and that those causes are manageable. A family moved away. A teenager made bad choices. A student needed a different environment. Each explanation stood on its own, clean and contained, requiring no emotional investment beyond mild concern. What logic did not allow was connection. Parents heard fragments from their children. Half-formed stories passed along in the evenings or over dinner. But those fragments were easy to dismiss. Teenagers exaggerate. They misinterpret. They crave drama. It was simpler to believe than to imagine something darker taking shape in a building designed to protect them. School administrators spoke in the language of reassurance. They emphasized privacy, policy, procedure. They reminded everyone that schools dealt with hundreds of students, each with their own challenges. They assured parents that nothing out of the ordinary was happening. And because nothing visibly out of the ordinary was happening, people believed them. There were no sirens, no police tape, no headlines. And without those signals, concern struggled to justify itself. The town trusted systems more than instincts. It trusted paperwork, meetings, and closed-door conversations. When someone asked a question that edged too close to discomfort, it was met with soft deflection, not denial. Denial invites argument, but redirection. A nod, a pause, a suggestion of focus on what was known rather than what was suspected. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was a culture. Teachers, many of whom had taught in the district for decades, understood the unspoken rules. You handled your classroom. You documented what was required. You escalated issues through proper channels, and then let them go. Questioning beyond that was seen as unprofessional, even disruptive. Careers were built on cooperation, not curiosity. A few teachers noticed the pattern forming. They felt it in their bones before they could articulate it. But each time they considered speaking up, they found themselves isolated by uncertainty. Were they imagining it? Were they overreacting? After all, no one else seemed alarmed. Isolation is a powerful silencer. The local media mirrored the town's restraint. The newspaper focused on sports scores, fundraisers, zoning meetings. A missing student might warrant a brief mention if a family reported it publicly, but most didn't. Some were advised not to. Others were reassured that attention would only complicate matters. The absence of coverage became proof, in many minds, that nothing was wrong. Churches preached patience. Community leaders urged unity. Conversations that began with concern often ended with reassurance. People learned quickly which topics made others uncomfortable, and like good neighbors, they avoided them. The missing students became awkward pauses in conversation, quickly filled with safer subjects. There was also an unspoken hierarchy at play. Some families carried more weight than others. Some voices traveled further in meetings and phone calls. The students who disappeared did not belong to the town's most influential households. They were not the children of donors or board members. Their absence did not disrupt power. This fact was never acknowledged out loud, but it shaped every response. Parents of the missing students experienced a quieter form of resistance. They were met with sympathy that stopped short of action, with concern that did not translate into urgency. They were told investigations took time, that teenagers were unpredictable, that sometimes answers didn't come easily. Over time, exhaustion set in. It is difficult to maintain outrage when it isn't shared. Difficult to keep pushing when every door opens just enough to let hope in, then closes again. Some families move away. Others withdrew into themselves. Their grief became private, their questions unanswered. The town interpreted this withdrawal as resolution. Years later, people would say they never realized how many students were gone, that they thought it was fewer, that they assumed there were explanations they simply weren't privy to. These statements were not lies. They were the natural outcome of a system that fragmented responsibilities so thoroughly that no one felt accountable for the whole picture. The town didn't ignore the disappearances. It disassembled them. Each absence was treated as a separate story, handled by different people, in different offices, under different assumptions. No single person held all the pieces long enough to see the shape they formed together. And those who came close were discouraged by the sheer weight of implication, because acknowledging the pattern meant acknowledging failure. Failure of oversight, failure of protection, failure of community. It was easier to believe that nothing connected these disappearances than to face what connection might imply. Easier to trust that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. Easier to move on. And so the town did what it had always done best. It carried on. The school year ended. Summer arrived. The building emptied out. Lockers were cleaned. Hallways echoed with absence. But absence was nothing new by then. The next class arrived in the fall, unaware of what had happened a year before. Time smoothed the edges of concern. Memories dulled. Stories shortened. What remained was a town that believed it had done nothing wrong, because it had never been forced to admit that it had done anything at all. The silence that followed was not the silence of secrecy. It was a silence of consensus, the quiet agreement that some questions were better left unasked. And in that silence, whatever truth existed found room to settle, undisturbed, waiting for a future that would finally refuse to look away. The gym was never just a room. It was the largest space in the building, the one place where walls pulled back and the school revealed its full size. Every other room divided students into rows, grades, or roles. The gym did the opposite. It gathered everyone together and asked them to become something collective, a crowd, a team, a class. It was where the school tried to feel like a single body instead of a series of corridors. In the mornings, the gym smelled faintly of sweat and cleaning solution, the echo of yesterday's effort lingering in the air. By afternoon, it filled with movement, bodies in motion, voices overlapping, whistles cutting through the noise. At night, during games or assemblies, it transformed entirely. Lights brightened, bleachers filled. The town arrived and took its seats, looking down at the polished floor like an audience watching itself perform. For students, the gym was a stage whether they wanted it to be or not. It was where achievements were celebrated publicly, where failures were witnessed, where popularity became visible in the space between people on the bleachers. The gym held pep rallies that demanded enthusiasm and assemblies that demanded silence. It asked students to participate in rituals they didn't always understand but learned to accept as necessary. For the missing students, the gym had been unavoidable. Some were athletes, their routines tied directly to that space. Practices stretched late into the afternoon, long after most students had gone home. The building grew quieter then, the halls dimmer, the sense of supervision looser. Others passed through for mandatory events. Sitting among classmates who barely noticed them, their presence recorded only by memory. It was in the gym that many of them were last seen, though at the time, no one knew to mark those moments. A student sitting alone on the lowest bleacher during a pep rally, clapping half-heartedly. Another lingering near the equipment room after practice, tying shoes with no urgency to leave. A third waiting by the exit as the crowd thinned, scrolling through a notebook or staring at the floor. These were not dramatic scenes. They were ordinary, forgettable moments in a place built for spectacle. That ordinariness was part of what made the gym feel safe. Adults trusted it because it was open, visible, communal. There were no locked doors, no dark corners that weren't quickly filled with sound and movement. The gym was where rules were enforced loudly and publicly, where teachers and coaches exerted control through presence and volume. It did not feel like a place where secrets could survive. And yet, the gym was also the one room that belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. No single teacher claimed it as their own. Responsibilities shifted depending on the hour, the event, the season. Oversight was constant but fragmented. There was always someone in charge, but never the same someone for long. In that rotation, attention blurred. The missing students moved through the space the way they moved through the rest of the school, noticed individually but never collectively. Their faces were familiar enough to blend into the background. Their absences, when they began to occur, were easier to rationalize here than anywhere else. After all, the gym was full of people. If something was wrong, someone would see it. That belief, that visibility equals safety, ran deep. Assemblies continued as usual. The principal's voice echoed through the room, announcing achievements, reminding students of expectations. Applause rose and fell on cue. The missing students' names were not called, but neither were they called out. Their absence was absorbed into noise, lost in the rhythm of routine. Basketball season arrived, and with it, packed stands and Friday night lights. The gym filled with energy, the kind that convinces a town it is united, strong, unbroken. People cheered for their children, their neighbors, their shared identity. They stood together. Unaware of how close together, they already were to something unspeakable. The floor beneath their feet gleamed. That floor had been resurfaced more than once over the years. Layers added, lines repainted. Each update meant to improve performance, safety, appearance. Each one reinforcing the idea that the gym was cared for, maintained, transparent. No one thought to question what lay beneath those layers. Why would they? The gym was also where discipline was enforced. Detentions were held there. Coaches pulled students aside for quiet conversations after practice. Administrators addressed conflicts under the guise of talking it out. It was a space that balanced authority and trust, firmness and familiarity. For students already on the margins, the gym could feel overwhelming. Too loud, too exposed, too full of eyes that didn't quite see them. It was a place where you learned quickly where you stood in the hierarchy, where comparison was unavoidable. And yet, it was also a place where rules softened at the edges, where supervision depended on event schedules, where moments existed between crowds, before and after, when the room felt cavernous and oddly empty. Those in-between moments mattered more than anyone realized. After practice ended, after assemblies broke up, after the last game of the night, the gym did not immediately return to silence. There was always a lag, a stretch of time where people filter out unevenly. Coaches gathered equipment. Custodians waited to clean. A few students lingered, reluctant or delayed. It was during these moments that memory becomes unreliable. Years later, when people tried to reconstruct timelines, they struggled. Everyone remembered seeing the missing students, but no one remembered seeing them leave. The gym had been full, then empty, without a clear boundary between the two states. The room itself offered no answers. It stood unchanged, a constant in a story defined by loss. It hosted graduations where caps flew into the air and futures were celebrated. It welcomed new classes who had no idea what had preceded them. It carried on, doing exactly what it was designed to do: contain sound, contain movement, contain attention. What it also contained, though no one knew at the time, was the weight of unresolved absence, the kind that settles into a place when questions are avoided long enough, the kind that doesn't fade, no matter how many layers are added on top. By the end of that school year, the gym had witnessed everything it was ever going to witness. The last ordinary moments before the story slipped fully into silence. The last time the missing students were just students, not mysteries. It remained standing, open and bright, holding on to what everyone else was willing to let go of, waiting. When people later tried to remember the 12 students, they rarely started with names. They began with impressions, a laugh that cut through noise, a habit of sitting near the window, a tendency to arrive late and leave early, as if already halfway somewhere else. Memory, when it is forced to work backward, does not organize itself neatly. It reaches for feeling before fact. None of the 12 had been famous within the school. They weren't the kind of students whose absence would stop a hallway conversation mid-sentence. They existed in the margins between cliques, between expectations, between labels that never quite fit. Each of them was known well enough to be recognized, but not well enough to be anchored. That made them easy to lose. One student was remembered for always carrying a notebook, its pages filled with dense handwriting no one ever read. Teachers assumed it was homework. Classmates assumed it was nothing important. When the notebook stopped appearing on the desk, no one asked where it had gone. Another was known as difficult, not disruptive enough to be dangerous, just enough to be exhausting. Their name appeared in disciplinary notes with familiar frequency. Warnings, detentions, conversations that ended with sighs and reminders about potential. When they disappeared, the assumption followed them. Trouble had finally caught up. There was a girl who smiled at everyone, but belonged nowhere. She floated between groups, welcome but never invited. Her yearbook photo showed confidence, but those who knew her better remembered how often she looked past people instead of at them. When she stopped coming to school, some thought she had simply drifted somewhere else. A quiet athlete made the team every year without drawing attention. Reliable, consistent, not a star. Coaches valued him because he followed rules and filled space where needed. When he vanished, the team adjusted without ceremony. His jersey was passed down. Practice went on. Another student was known mostly through rumor, stories that shifted depending on who told them. Home life problems, bad influences. None of it confirmed, all of it convenient. The rumor survived long after the student didn't. What connected them was not behavior or background, but vulnerability. Some struggled academically, others socially, a few emotionally. They were the ones teachers worried about privately but rarely discussed publicly. The ones counselors made notes about and promised to follow up with later. The ones who required effort without offering visible reward. They were present in the system, but never centered within it. As the year progressed and their absences accumulated, the language used to describe them grew flatter, at risk, challenging, complicated. Words that created distance while pretending to explain. Labels that allowed concern without demanding responsibility. Students noticed this shift, even if they couldn't articulate it. They learned which kinds of absences provoked sympathy and which provoked indifference. They learned that some stories were easier to forget than others. When the missing students were mentioned at all, it was often in the past tense, as if they had already become something finished. There was no collective grieving, no shared confusion. Each memory existed in isolation, detached from the others. A friend might wonder what happened, then stop wondering because no one else seemed to be asking. A teacher might hesitate over an empty seat, then fill it with another student and move on. A counselor might review a file and close it, trusting that someone else would take the next step. No one ever did. The town had a way of categorizing people early. Some students were seen as having futures that extended clearly beyond high school, college, careers, stability. Others were seen as uncertain investments, their paths less predictable, their outcomes less assured. The 12 students belonged mostly to the second category. That categorization shaped the response to their absence more than anyone wanted to admit. Parents of other students expressed concern in private, but not loudly. They worried about safety in the abstract, then reassured themselves that their own children were different, safer, less likely to slip through cracks. This belief was comforting, even if it was false. Within the school, the missing students' names slowly disappeared from everyday language. They stopped being used as examples. Their work stopped being referenced. Their stories stopped circulating. Silence filled a space where memory should have been. Yet traces remained. A locker that stayed dented longer than the others. A book left behind in a classroom, unclaimed. A note scribbled in the margin of a shared assignment. These objects lingered, unnoticed by most, but heavy with meaning for those who remembered. The 12 students became a kind of negative space in the school's history, defined not by what was known, but by what was absent. Their disappearance created gaps that were subtle enough to ignore, but impossible to fully erase. Years later, during reunions or chant encounters, former classmates would try to piece together what happened. They would compare memories, surprised to find how inconsistent they were. One person remembered a student leaving early in the year. Another remembered them being there until spring. Dates blurred. Details shifted. What remained consistent was the feeling that something had been wrong. Not dramatic wrong. Not urgent wrong. But the kind of wrong that settles in slowly like mold behind walls. The kind that thrives in neglect. The 12 students were not forgotten all at once. They were forgotten gradually, in increments small enough to justify. Each omission seemed harmless on its own. Together, they formed a silence loud enough to hide almost anything. By the time the year ended, their absence had been normalized. They were no longer discussed as missing, only as gone. The distinction mattered. Gone implied conclusion. Missing implied responsibility. The school chose the easier word, and in doing so, it allowed the 12 students to become exactly what the system had always treated them as: background figures, easy to overlook, difficult to advocate for, and ultimately, expendable in memory if not in life. Their stories did not end when they disappeared. They ended when no one insisted on telling them. By the time the final year began, the school behaved as if it were closing a book rather than finishing a chapter. There was a sense that everything unresolved would soon be rendered irrelevant by time. Graduation had that effect on people. It promised endings where none truly existed. It offered ceremony as substitute for understanding. And for a class already missing pieces, the promise of moving on felt less like celebration and more like relief. Senior year arrived with its rituals intact. College applications, senior portraits, lists of accomplishments posted in hallways. The machinery of closure moved efficiently, indifferent to what it carried forward and what it left behind. The 12 students were no longer part of the daily conversation, not even as absence. They existed only in peripheral memory, if at all. Their lockers had been reassigned. Their names had been removed from rosters. Their desks no longer waited for them. The school did not mark this as loss. It marked it as administration. Teachers, many of whom had taught these students just months earlier, adjusted quickly. They had learned over years in the system that unresolved questions could stall progress. Better to focus on those who remained. Better to finish strong. Better to believe that whatever had happened was no longer theirs to carry. Some told themselves that the missing students would resurface somewhere else. Another school, another town, another version of life. This belief required no evidence, only distance. Parents followed suit. They were busy preparing their children for what came next. Financial aid forms, dorm shopping lists, conversations about adulthood that assumed a clean break from the past. The disappearances became inconvenient reminders of uncertainty at a moment designed for optimism. And optimism, once it takes hold, resists disruption. The yearbook staff finalized pages with careful precision. Faces were aligned, names spelled correctly, group photos cropped to perfection. In earlier drafts, some of the missing students still appeared. Class photos taken before their disappearances. Candid shots captured before anyone thought to question permanence. But revisions were made. It was explained as consistency. You don't include people who won't be there at graduation. You don't memorialize what hasn't been officially acknowledged. You don't invite questions you don't intend to answer. By the time the final copies were printed, the 12 students existed only in the copies already tucked away in storage rooms and forgotten desks. The version of history being distributed to the class was cleaner, lighter, easier to carry. Graduation rehearsals took place in the gym. Rows of chairs were arranged with mathematical precision. Names were read aloud in order, students standing and sitting on cue. The sound of chairs moving in unison filled the space. The gym, once again, gathered everyone together and asked them to become a single body. There were no empty chairs, no pauses in the list, no visible evidence that anything was missing. On the day of graduation, families filled the bleachers. Cameras flashed. Applause swelled and receded like a tide. The ceremony followed its script perfectly, each moment flowing seamlessly into the next. Pride dominated the air, thick enough to obscure discomfort. The class crossed the stage incomplete, and no one said so out loud. Afterward, people lingered in clusters, taking photos, hugging, laughing. The future pressed close, demanding attention. In moments like these, the past tend to lose its grip. People believe they are allowed to let go. Some graduates felt it, though, a strange hollowness beneath the celebration, an awareness that the class photo didn't quite match the memory, that the joy felt slightly forced, slightly rushed. But these feelings were easily dismissed as nerves, exhaustion, the way to transition. Everyone was leaving something behind. That was the point. Summer arrived quickly after. The school emptied. Classrooms were stripped of personality. Posters came down. Chalkboards were erased. The building reverted to a neutral state, ready to be repurposed for the next cycle. Whatever questions still existed had nowhere to live. Those who left town rarely looked back. New environments demanded new attention. College campuses, jobs, relationships, all of it crowded out old concerns. The missing students became anecdotes at best, half-remembered stories told late at night, if at all. Those who stayed behind adapted, in a different way. They absorbed the silence into routine. The school welcomed a new class, one that knew nothing of what had happened before. Teachers reused lesson plans. Administrators reused language. The system reset itself with practice efficiency. Time did the rest. Years passed without incident. The town grew older, but not wiser. New problems emerged. New controversies demanded attention. The disappearances faded into obscurity, surviving only in the private memories of those who had been there. And memory, when unsupported, erodes. Details softened. Timelines blurred. Certainty dissolved into feeling. People began to doubt their own recollections. Maybe there weren't 12. Maybe it wasn't that strange. Maybe it was just one of those things that feels bigger in hindsight than it really was. This doubt was not accidental. It was a natural consequence of closure without truth. The school, for its part, carried on. It celebrated anniversaries. It honored alumni. It displayed trophies in glass cases. The gym hosted new graduations, new beginnings layered over the old. Each ceremony reinforced the idea that the institution endured, unchanged by whatever had absorbed. But institutions do not feel the weight of what they carry. People do. Some former students never returned. Not out of fear, but discomfort. The building reminded them of something unresolved, something they couldn't name without sounding unreasonable. They avoided reunions. They avoided the town itself. Distance felt safer than confrontation. Others returned often, drawn back by nostalgia that refused to separate itself from unease. They walked familiar hallways and felt a subtle rawness they couldn't place. Like a word on the tip of the tongue, the truth hovered just out of reach. 30 years would pass before anyone forced to pass back into focus. Before the school, in an attempt to modernize, would disrupt the careful layering of time. Before the gym floor, replaced and resurfaced so many times, would finally be lifted far enough to reveal that closure had been an illusion. In that final year, everything had been designed to end. What no one understood then was that endings built on silence don't conclude stories. They suspend them. They wait patiently, embedded in routine, until someone comes along and accidentally asks the wrong question. And when that happens, the past doesn't reappear gently. It comes back all at once. 30 years is long enough for a town to forget the sound of its own questions. The school changed in small, unremarkable ways over the decades. Lockers were replaced. Classrooms updated with new technology that promised progress. Teachers retired, some after long farewell speeches, others slipping out quietly at the end of a term. New faces took their place, unaware of the building's history beyond what was written in approved summaries. Each generation of students believed they were the first to walk those halls. The disappearances from 1994 did not vanish entirely. They thinned. They stretched. They lost their sharp edges and became something softer, easier to live with. A rumor here, a half-memory there, a strange feeling that surfaced during reunions and then retreated when no one else seemed interested in exploring it. People moved on because life demanded it. Those who left town rarely spoke about high school at all. When they did, the stories focused on safer things: sports victories, favorite teachers, awkward dances. The missing students were not part of these narratives. To include them would have meant reopening something without knowing how to close it again. Those who stayed learned a different kind of forgetting, not erasure, but accommodation. The past was folded into the present in a way that removed its urgency. It became background noise, present but ignorable. The town grew around the silence. New houses were built. Businesses opened and closed. Children born years after 1994 passed through the same school without any awareness that something fundamental had been left unresolved. For them, the gym was just a gym, a place for assemblies, games, graduations. It carried no emotional residue because no one had taught them to feel it. That absence of teaching mattered. Memory is not automatic. It is transferred, reinforced, protected. When a story stops being told, it doesn't disappear immediately. It weakens. It fractures. It becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation, dismissal, and eventually denial. Some parents from the original class tried, briefly, to keep the memory alive. They brought up the missing students at community meetings. They asked questions that received polite responses and little else. Over time, their voices grew quieter, not because the concern faded, but because it was met with fatigue. People only have so much space for unresolved grief that doesn't belong directly to them. As years passed, even the families of the missing students faced pressure to move on, to accept uncertainty as a kind of answer, to find peace in the absence of explanation. Society rewards closure, even when it is artificial. Those who refused closure were seen as stuck, unable to heal. The town did not want to see itself that way. Records from 1994 aged poorly. Paper documents yellowed. Files were boxed, moved, mislabeled. Early digital records were corrupted or incompatible with newer systems. What remained was incomplete, disjointed. Pieces of information existed, but rarely in the same place. This fragmentation was unintentional, but effective. A future investigator would have to want the truth badly enough to reconstruct it. And for decades, no one did. Not because they didn't care, but because caring required effort, discomfort, and the risk of uncovering something that could not be undone. In the absence of investigation, speculation filled the gaps. Stories grew more dramatic, less accurate. Some people claimed the students had run away together. Others suggested secret transfers, underground programs, families covering up scandals. Each theory allowed people to engage with the mystery without confronting the possibility of institutional failure. Fiction was easier than responsibility. The gym, meanwhile, remained the town's emotional center. It hosted charity events, political town halls, wedding receptions. Life continued to gather there, layer upon layer, as if weight alone could compress memory into irrelevance. Every new coat of polish on the floor felt like a quiet reaffirmation. This place is clean. This place is safe. This place has nothing to hide. Maintenance logs showed routine care. Inspections passed. Renovations focused on aesthetics rather than structure. No one thought to question what lay beneath the visible surface. There was no reason to, except for the feeling. Some people reported it years later. A subtle discomfort when standing in the gym alone. A heaviness that couldn't be explained by architecture or lighting. A sense that the space carried something unfinished. These feelings were usually dismissed as imagination, nostalgia, or anxiety. Modern life does not encourage people to trust intuition. Reunions mark the passage of time with uncomfortable precision. 10 years. 20. Faces age. Hair grayed. Lives diverged. The missing students, when mentioned at all, were spoken of in hushed tones, as if loudness might summon something no one was prepared to face. There were disagreements about how many there had been, about when exactly they left, about whether it had really been that strange. Memory had become unreliable, and that unreliability served as further justification for inaction. If no one could agree on the facts, how could anyone demand answers? And yet, beneath the confusion, a shared understanding persisted. Something had happened, something that had never been resolved, something that did not belong to any single person, but to the town as a whole. This understanding remained unspoken, but it shaped behavior in subtle ways. People avoided certain conversations. Certain anniversaries passed without acknowledgement. Certain names were never reused for buildings or scholarships. Silence became tradition. By the time 30 years had passed, the town believed the story was over, that whatever questions once existed had expired with relevance, that the past, if left undisturbed long enough, would eventually stop mattering. What no one considered was that time does not erase truth. It only delays its arrival. The gym floor, layered and relayered, had outlasted generations. It had been patient. It did not require memory to survive. It required only time and pressure. And as the town prepared for yet another round of renovations, yet another attempt to modernize and move forward, it had no idea that the silence it relied on was about to break. Not because someone chose to speak, but because the past, having waited long enough, was about to surface on its own. The renovation was supposed to be routine. The school district had approved it months earlier, bundled into a list of long overdue upgrades that had nothing to do with history. The gym floor, worn thin by decades of use, had finally reached a point where resurfacing was no longer enough. Cracks had begun to form beneath the finish. The wood no longer responded the way it once had. Safety reports cited concern, and concern translated into funding. No one associated the decision with memory. Work began early in the summer, when the building was mostly empty and the heat lingered in hallways long after the sun had set. Construction crews moved through the school with practiced efficiency, treating classrooms and common areas as interchangeable spaces. To them, the gym was just another job site, another surface to be stripped down and rebuilt. The first day passed without incident. The second day brought the smell of old wood and dust, thick enough to cling to clothing. Sections of the floor were removed carefully, stacked and labeled for disposal. Beneath them lay layers of material added over the years, adhesives, padding, evidence of maintenance done and redone. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, until one section resisted. It wasn't dramatic at first. A panel that didn't lift cleanly, a resistance that felt wrong, not stubborn, but intentional. The tools used should have worked. They always did. But this piece held, as if anchored by something beyond wear and tear. The crew paused. They adjusted their approach, assuming oversight or age. When the section finally gave way, it did so unevenly, revealing a structure beneath that did not belong to any standard gym design. The workers stood still, staring. What they saw wasn't immediately identifiable as anything specific. That made it worse. It was an alteration, clearly planned, clearly executed with care. Reinforcements where none should have been. Materials that suggested concealment rather than support. A deliberate separation between the visible floor and the space below. Someone said it must have been an old repair. Someone else shook their head. Repairs didn't look like this. A quiet settled over the gym, the kind that makes people aware of their own breathing. The echo of footsteps sounded too loud, too intrusive. Tools were set down. Phones came out. Photos were taken, then quickly put away, as if documenting the moment might make it more real. The foreman made a call. School administrators arrived within the hour, their expressions shifting as they took in the scene. Questions were asked, but the answers were unsatisfying. No one recognized the structure. No one could explain why it wasn't in the records. The blueprints were pulled and reviewed, pages flipping faster as unease grew. This wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. Work was halted immediately. The gym was closed off, access restricted. Language turned cautious, procedural. An unexpected structural anomaly. Further evaluation required. Safety first. The phrases were familiar, comforting in their vagueness. But word travels differently when something feels wrong. A custodian mentioned it to a co-worker. A worker mentioned it to a spouse. A spouse mentioned it to a neighbor. By the end of the day, people were asking questions the official statements didn't answer. What was under the floor? Why had it been built that way? Who knew? The gym, once the most open space in the building, became the most guarded. Doors were locked. Signs posted. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt intentional. Some of the older staff reacted differently than the rest. They lingered near the entrance longer than necessary. They asked questions that didn't sound like curiosity so much as dread. A few went quiet altogether, as if speaking might trigger something they'd worked hard to suppress. Memories long dormant began to stir. People started connecting dots they hadn't known were related. A missing student. A conversation cut short years ago. A moment that hadn't made sense at the time, but now refused to be ignored. The past, fragmented and softened by time, began to pull itself back together. Officials called in specialists, engineers, inspectors. Each approached the discovery with professional detachment. But even that cracked under scrutiny. This was not an accident of construction. It was not the result of poor planning or decay. It was deliberate concealment. As sections of floor were carefully removed, the scale of the modification became clearer. It wasn't isolated. It was systematic, designed to hide something large enough to require planning, approval, and silence. The gym floor had not simply been built over something. It had been built to cover it. Those overseeing the process avoided eye contact. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Lawyers were consulted. Language tightened further, stripping emotion from communication. The district emphasized patience, responsibility, discretion, but discretion only fed suspicion. Parents demanded answers. Alumni began calling, emailing, showing up. The story had reached beyond the town now, carried by the kind of rumor that thrives on withheld information. Reporters asked for confirmation. Statements were drafted and revised, each version saying less than the one before. The town felt exposed, not because the truth was known, but because it was no longer entirely hidden. Standing in the gym during those days felt different. The air was heavier, the echo sharper. People spoke in whispers without realizing it. The room no longer felt neutral. It felt like a container that had been opened too late. Some refused to enter at all. Others felt drawn to it, compelled by a need to witness whatever came next. They stood behind barriers, peering through doorways, trying to reconcile the familiar with the unbearable. The renovation had done something no investigation ever had. It disrupted the silence. Whatever had been buried beneath the gym floor was no longer content to remain there. It had waded through graduations, renovations, generations. It had survived the town forgetting. And now, exposed to life for the first time, it demanded to be acknowledged, not as rumor, not as theory, but as something real, undeniable, and irreversible. The past had not returned gently. It had forced its way back into the present, breaking through layers of wood, routine, and denial. And there was no putting it back. Once the floor was opened, attention shifted away from the gym and toward the past it had been hiding. The first instinct of the school district was containment, not physical this time, but informational. Meetings multiplied. Emails circulated marked confidential. The language used in these communications was careful, almost sterile, as if emotion itself posed a risk. The goal was no longer discovery, but control. Control of narrative. Control of liability. Control of time. That urgency exposed something else. Records were requested. Attendance logs from the early 1990s. Maintenance reports. Renovation approvals. Budget documents that tracked where money had been spent and why. The town had believed these records would provide clarity. Instead, they revealed absence in a different form. Files were missing. Not all of them. Just enough to matter. Some attendance records ended abruptly, with names removed but no accompanying explanation. Maintenance logs referenced work orders that could not be located. Renovation approvals cited meetings that no one could remember, decisions attributed to committees that no longer existed. Nothing was falsified outright. That would have been obvious. Instead, information had been allowed to thin, to fragment, to drift just far enough apart that no single document told a complete story. This was not the work of one person. It was a result of a system that prioritized smooth operation over accountability. The deeper investigators went, the more they realized how easy it had been for truth to disappear without ever being officially erased. Privacy laws limited what could be shared. Personnel changes disrupted continuity. Technology upgrades rendered old formats unreadable. Each transition created gaps, and those gaps multiplied over time. In the absence of intention, neglect had done its work. A name appeared in a roster one year and vanished the next, replaced by a notation too vague to raise alarms. A maintenance expense was approved without a clear description, folded into a broader category that masked its purpose. A request was signed off by someone who trusted the process, not realizing what they were authorizing. Responsibility dissolved across layers of administration. When former staff were contacted, many expressed genuine shock. They remembered the year, vaguely. They remembered that some students had left. They did not remember asking why. Each person had assumed someone else knew more. That assumption had been enough. The language used in internal memos from the time was revealing in its restraint. Words like resolve, addressed, and handled appeared frequently, rarely followed by detail. These terms created the illusion of action without requiring transparency. No one document admitted wrongdoing. No single signature carried blame. The system had protected itself through diffusion. As journalists and legal experts began reviewing the material, a pattern emerged, not a conspiracy, but convenience. Decisions had been made quickly, quietly, always with an eye toward minimizing disruption. The school's reputation had been preserved not through lies, but through omission. And omission, repeated often enough, becomes indistinguishable from intent. The records also revealed how the disappearances had been categorized. Each student's departure was logged under a different reason: transfer, withdrawal, alternative placement, family relocation. These categories, while technically permissible, obscured the collective reality. There was no column for unexplained, no mechanism for recognizing patterns. The system had been designed to handle individuals, not anomalies. When something didn't fit, it was broken down until it did. Parents of missing students, when shown the records decades later, reacted with a mix of grief and disbelief. Some had never seen these documents. Others recognized phrases they'd been told verbally, now frozen in bureaucrat language. This was the story they had been given. Seeing it laid out so clinically only deepened the wound. The gym floor had revealed what paper never could. It had provided physical proof where documentation had failed. And in doing so, it forced a reckoning with the idea that truth does not always survive in files and forms. Sometimes, it survives in places no one thinks to look. As pressure mounted, officials were asked a question that could no longer be deflected. How had a structural modification of the scale gone undocumented? The answer, when it came, was unsatisfying and deeply unsettling. It hadn't gone undocumented. It had gone unquestioned. Approvals had been granted based on trust. Trust in colleagues. Trust in procedure. Trust that no one would propose something unjustifiable. That trust had replaced oversight, and oversight had quietly disappeared. The records told a story of a system that worked exactly as designed: efficient, compartmentalized, resistant to disruption. It was a system that could hide almost anything, as long as no one insisted on seeing the whole picture. By the time the final report was compiled, it was clear that the truth could not be assigned to a single failure. It belonged to decades of small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, devastating in total. The gym floor had been the only honest witness. Everything else had learned how to look away. By the time the final layer was removed, there was no longer any room for doubt. What lay beneath the gym floor was not chaos, not an accident, not the result of structural decay or miscalculation. It was order, deliberate, measured, intentional order, the kind that only exists when someone has taken the time to think through consequences and then decided they were acceptable. Investigators moved carefully now. Every step was documented, every action observed. The room no longer belonged to the school. It belonged to the truth. The casual familiarity people once felt toward the gym was gone, replaced by a reverence that bordered on fear. The space beneath the floor revealed how much effort had gone into concealment. Support beams had been repositioned. Material selected not for strength alone, but for silence. The architecture told its own story, one that did not rely on memory or testimony. This was not improvisation. It was design. The implications settled heavily over everyone present. This had taken planning, which meant it had taken agreement. As more of the structure was exposed, connections became unavoidable. The timing aligned with the year. The 12 students disappeared. The scale matched what had been suspected but never proven. The gym, long celebrated as communal heart, had been repurposed into something else entirely, a lid. The reaction was not immediate hysteria. It was slower, heavier, the kind of shock that drains energy instead of releasing it. People stared longer than necessary. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Some left the room quietly, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with the place they thought they knew. For the first time, the town was forced to confront a possibility it had spent 30 years avoiding, that the disappearances were not separate, that they were not misunderstandings, that they were not the result of bad luck or poor communication. They were connected by design. The revelation did not answer every question, but answered the most important one. This had been hidden on purpose. The gym floor was not a coincidence of location. It was chosen because it was central, trusted, unquestioned, a place no one would suspect because everyone believed they understood it. The irony was unbearable. This was where the town gathered to celebrate itself, where it reinforced its identity, its values, its sense of safety. And beneath it, something had been sealed away precisely because no one would want to believe it could exist there. As news broke beyond the town, reactions poured in from former students scattered across the country. Many hadn't thought about high school in years. Some had barely remembered the missing students at all. But now, faced with physical proof, memories rushed back with unsettling clarity. Moments they had dismissed, feelings they had ignored, a vague discomfort that finally made sense. For the families of the 12 students, the revelation was both confirmation and devastation. Confirmation that their doubts had been justified, devastation that the truth had waited so long to surface. There was no relief in being right, only grief sharpened by time. They learned that what they had suspected privately had been acknowledged silently by others, that the town had known enough to look away, that the system had functioned smoothly while their lives fractured. Some demanded accountability. Others wanted nothing more than acknowledgement. Years of unanswered questions had taught them that justice, when delayed this long, rarely arrives whole. Officials struggled to respond. Statements were released and revised. Apologies were drafted in language that attempted to balance regret with legal caution. Words like unimaginable and unthinkable were used, despite the fact that someone had clearly imagined this, had thought it through in detail, and had acted on it. The town's image cracked. People who had once defended its quiet reputation now questioned what that quiet had cost. Silence, once a sign of stability, began to feel like complicity. The absence of outrage in the past was no longer neutral. It was evidence. The gym, stripped of its floor, stood exposed and unrecognizable. Without the polished surface, the room felt raw, almost unfinished. The banners overhead seemed out of place now, relics of narrative that could no longer be sustained. There was talk of demolition, of memorialization, of what should be done with a space that had been transformed so completely in meaning. No decision felt adequate. No action felt sufficient, because what had been uncovered was not just a secret. It was a failure shared across generations. The town could no longer pretend that it hadn't known enough to ask questions, that it hadn't sensed something wrong. The physical evidence beneath the floor made one thing painfully clear. Silence had not been ignorance. It had been choice. A choice made easier by time, hierarchy, and convenience. The twist was not that something terrible had happened. The twist was where it had been allowed to happen, not in shadows, not on the outskirts, but at the center of the community, beneath the place where everyone stood together and believed they were safe. The gym floor had been removed, but what it revealed could not be covered again. No renovation could restore what had been lost. No explanation could undo the years of absence, the birthdays missed, the lives never lived. What remained was a reckoning, not just with what had been done, but with how easily it had been absorbed into routine, how quickly the extraordinary had been rendered invisible, how a town had learned to live on top of something unbearable by simply refusing to look down. And now that the truth was exposed, there was only one certainty left. Nothing built on silence ever stays buried forever. After the floor was gone, the town was left standing on something it didn't recognize. The immediate aftermath was loud in ways the previous 30 years had not been. News vans parked along streets that had never hosted them before. Cameras pointed at a building most people had passed without thought for decades. Reporters spoke in careful tones, aware that speculation could not substitute for facts, yet unable to ignore the weight of what had already been confirmed. The gym was closed indefinitely. Classes were relocated, events canceled or moved to neighboring towns. What had once been the center of communal life became a sealed space, surrounded by caution tape and unanswered questions. Students who currently attended the school sensed a shift even if they didn't fully understand it. Adults spoke around them, not to them. The building felt different now, less like a place of learning, more like a reminder. For the first time, the town had to sit with discomfort without the option of deflection. Memorials began to appear almost spontaneously. Flowers left near the school entrance, notes taped to fences, names written in chalk on sidewalks, some tentative, some bold, as if testing whether it was finally allowed to speak them. Candles burned down quietly in the evenings, tended by people who stood nearby without talking. There was no single ceremony that marked the reckoning, no moment that felt sufficient. Grief arrived unevenly, surfacing in bursts and then receding, leaving behind a fatigue deeper than anger. The families of the 12 students found themselves at the center of attention they had never sought. Strangers expressed sympathy. Apologies were offered by people who had not known what to say years earlier. Some of these gestures brought comfort. Others reopened wounds that had never truly healed. They were asked what they wanted now. Justice. Answers. Accountability. Closure. Each word felt incomplete. Legal processes moved slowly, burdened by time and complexity. Statutes were debated. Responsibility was parsed into categories that felt abstract compared to reality of loss. The law struggled to address something that had unfolded through silence rather than action. There were consequences, but they felt procedural. Resignations, reviews, policy changes. Committees formed to ensure this would never happen again. The town documented its remorse carefully, determined not to repeat the same mistake of omission. And yet, something essential remained unresolved. Former students returned, drawn back by a need they hadn't known how to name. They walked the grounds, tracing paths they remembered by muscle memory. Some stood outside the gym doors for long stretches, unsure whether they wanted to go in even if allowed. They talked to each other late into the night, comparing memories that no longer felt unreliable now that the truth had weight. Moments that once seemed insignificant snapped into focus. The feeling that something was wrong no longer required explanation. It had been right all along. The town held forums. People stood at microphones, voices shaking, expressing regret, confusion, guilt. Many admitted they had suspected something but lacked the courage to insist on answers. Others spoke about trust, how deeply they had trusted the institution, how betrayed they felt now. The word betrayal surfaced again and again. But betrayal implies a sudden act, a clear moment when trust is broken. What had happened here was slower, more diffuse. Trust had eroded quietly, worn down by convenience and fear of disruption. That made it harder to confront. The gym itself became the subject of debate. Some wanted it demolished, unable to imagine children playing on a space, so altered in meaning. Others argued for preservation, for transformation into a memorial that would refuse forgetting. Both sides spoke from pain, not ideology. No decision could restore what had been lost. In the end, the town realized that the question was not what to do with the building, but what to do with the knowledge it now carried. Truth, once uncovered, does not belong to the past. It becomes a responsibility in the present. People began to understand that the story did not end with exposure. Exposure was only the beginning. Teachers revised how they spoke about history, about systems, about silence. Parents listened more closely to their children. Administrators questioned processes that had once felt neutral and necessary. These changes were small, incremental, imperfect, but they mattered. Still at night, when the town quieted and the school stood dark, the weight of what had happened remained. Not as spectacle, not as constant grief, but as something settled and permanent, like a scar you no longer notice every day, but feel when the weather changes. The gym floor would eventually be replaced. Buildings always are, would be laid. lines repainted. Time would resume its forward motion. But the town understood now that replacement was not the same as erasure. The 12 students were no longer footnotes. Their absence had shaped. Their story had entered the collective memory, not as rumor, but as truth. And with that truth came an obligation. To remember without turning away. To question without waiting for permission. The ending, if it could be called that, was quiet. There was no moment when everything felt resolved. No sense of completion. Just a deeper awareness of how easily ordinary places can hold extraordinary secrets, and how much damage can be done without a single dramatic act. The gym had been a container for decades, for noise, for pride, for celebration. It had also been a container for silence. Now that silence had been broken, what remained was a town learning, too late but not entirely without hope, that forgetting is not the same as healing, and that the ground beneath us carries every choice we make, whether we acknowledge it or not. ChatGPT can make Miztac.